All right, so I'm just going to jump right into it because I don't have a ton of time and this is going to take a little bit to explain. Now, I hope this is your thing. It's Numbers, which is not my thing at all, but I still found this incredibly interesting. So I've been studying through 1st and 2nd Samuel pretty in-depth lately. Like, it's taken me a few months to get through, just going by chapter, verse by verse. And throughout the whole thing, you read through the Bible and there's still so much to learn, even after all the time you've been studying it. And I think that's one of the most incredible things about it. But on this time through, I just was writing note after note after note and asking question after question and looking different things up and reading commentaries and looking at the original language. And I just felt like the study was so fruitful until I got to the end of 2 Samuel and I felt really shortchanged. Like it had just all fallen flat and I didn't understand why. I was writing no notes in here and I couldn't figure out what I was supposed to be learning from this section, what the author was trying to teach me or tell me, and how these things were all connected. Now, if you're not familiar with the end of 2 Samuel, the whole story of 1st and 2nd Samuel is about David and his ascension to the throne. And so you'd kind of expect the book to end with his death, but it doesn't. That doesn't happen until 1 Kings. Instead, 2 Samuel 24 ends with this census that David takes of the nation of Israel. And also God's judgment of that, and then a command to build an altar at a specific spot. And so as I'm getting through this, it's like, yeah, okay, I understand why this is important. I've heard about this before, but some of the answers that I've received were kind of unsatisfactory. And so I just felt really let down, really deflated by this study and how it was coming to a close. Until I asked one pivotal question. I researched it on the internet and I just asked the simple question, why does 2 Samuel end in the census and not the death of David? And I actually got a myriad of different answers for that, but what I ended up finding was something so much richer and not even on that topic at all. What I ended up finding was that this last section, 2 Samuel 24, is actually full of really, really rich things that you have to kind of do a comparative study on. You kind of have to apply a little bit of hermeneutics to your study. It can't just be a straight read through and then you ask questions. You've got to go line by line. And so once you go through this, you realize that there's a reason God was so angry at David. There's a reason that the numbers in this census and the numbers that are reported in the census in 1 Chronicles, which is the same census, have different numbers. And so we're answering contradictions. We're going back in time to Israel's history and their laws and why they did like what they did. And we're going into this altar that David's building and the payment for it. So that's what we're going to be looking into. And I'm going to try and cover it very clearly, but it is numbers and it is kind of tricky. So I hope you follow me. I'm going to try and do this as clearly as possible. Okay, so David takes a census. Most people will say, well, it was wrong for David to do this because God didn't want a census taken. He didn't like the fact that David was trying to have his trust in his own military might, his own power. He was being prideful and egotistical, looking at his nation and saying, look at how much I built this up. There's a problem with this, though. There are actual laws in the Old Testament that God laid out as far as how you are supposed to conduct a census. And so he expected that it would happen from time to time, and he wasn't against it. But he laid out rules for how it should happen. And you find that in Exodus chapter 30. And when you read Exodus chapter 30 on these rules of whenever Israel is to take a census, you come away with 4 different things. For one, it's so that you can register all the people of Israel, and each person that's over 20 is supposed to pay a half shekel or 1 shekel per 2 persons. And so that's the first thing, is that it's not just a counting of people. They're actually buying into the nation this small amount of a half shekel. And so if they're not buying in, there's a consequence, because every so often God would do this. There'd be a plague that gets sent on the nation, but he would protect the people of Israel. But if you're not numbered amongst the people of Israel, if you haven't bought into the nation, then that protection doesn't extend to you. It specifically says you do this so that no plague is brought on those who are registered. So you've got this promise of a plague to those who don't buy in. You have the precedent set that you do buy in, half a shekel for every person over 20. And then you also have that this money is given on behalf of the tabernacle, at least in the book of Exodus. And so it's given in service to the faith of the nation. And literally at that time, they were smelting down metals and making them into instruments in use in their religion, their faith. But this is like not only a symbol of you buying into the nation, but you're also buying into the faith of your nation. So it's complete solidarity on a nationalistic and on a faith level. And that's what's happening with the census. And no person over or under 20 is supposed to be counted. Now you ask why? Why is that? Why is it such a big deal if you count those under 20? I understand there has to be a cutoff at some point. Even the American census today doesn't include those under 18, right? You're 18, you become an adult, and you are part of the census at that point. But why 20? Well, in Genesis 15, as just one place among so many others, God makes a promise to Israel. He says that he is going to multiply the number of Israel through their offspring to a number that is too many to count. Oftentimes it'll say as the sand of the sea, as the stars of the sky, but this is a promise from God that you're not supposed to number these people. Don't take me to task on this. I'm going to perform it. Have faith that I'm going to perform it. Your offspring will multiply, and they're going to be too numerous to count. And the offspring here is indicative of the under 20s. So under 20 was considered the offspring of Israel. Once you were 20 and over, then you became a part of Israel. You were a full-fledged adult at that point. And so this is why you don't count them, because God's saying they're going to be too numerous to count. I don't want you going and counting them and trying to take me to task on the blessing I promise you. So how does this all factor into David's census? In 1 Chronicles 27, verse 24, we get a little bit of insight into David's census, because in 2 Samuel, it says nothing about the under 20s. But in 1 Chronicles 27, verse 24, it says that Joab was really mad at David, and we don't really understand why. If there's precedent for keeping a census, and David commands this of his general, why is it a problem that this should be a thing the king does? The problem is that David commanded the counting of all of Israel and Judah, even those under 20. And Joab had some misgivings about this. Say what you want about him, he wasn't the best guy, and his story doesn't end the best. But in this, he was absolutely right. He was not comfortable with trying to count out the number of people that God said would be too numerous. And in 1 Chronicles 27:24, you see that David, it almost appears as if David doesn't get the count of those under 20, because it says David did not count those who were under 20 because God said he would make them too numerous. And so you think, okay, David didn't get them. But in the very next verse, you see it says Joab began to count those, but stopped. And then the wrath of the Lord still fell on the nation for having done this. So God's wrath comes on the nation not because David took a census, which maybe he was being prideful, but it's because he was trying to overinflate his numbers by counting those who God said, you are not supposed to count those. That is a number for me to determine. That is a blessing I'm going to give you, and you don't come to me and hold me to task on this. I told you I'd bless you. Trust that I'll bless you. So this is why Joab, in his count, he goes all the way through Israel and Judah, counting all those under 20 and those over 20. And this is why God gets so mad. Now let's look at the numbers. So in 2 Samuel 24, verse 9, where it does include the number that are under 20, it says the total number of people in Israel and Judah is 1,300,000. In 1 Chronicles 21, verse 5, where it says that this number under 20 was not added to the book of the Chronicles of the Kings, you have a number that's totally different. It's 1,100,000. So there's a difference of 200,000. And when you're considering that one book counts those under 20, one book doesn't, that means you have 200,000 people under 20 counted in this census. Now we fast forward to this plague that comes on Israel, which is super interesting because it's the same kind of thing that happens in Exodus when it says if you count a census and people don't buy into the census, a plague is going to come on those people who don't buy in. And so David, by counting these people under 20, unleashes this plague. And it's not just a plague on the entirety of Israel and Judah. It's a plague on those who did not pay in the census. Well, who wouldn't have paid? the under 20s. There's no precedent for those under 20 to pay that half shekel. There is precedent in some of the censuses to count those under 20, but never to have them pay. And so God did not command that he count those under 20. So David has justified that, well, it's happened before, they've counted those under 20. Or, well, I was under 20 when I killed Goliath. I was a full man then, so why can't they be counted too? So he justifies it in his mind and counts those under 20, but there's no biblical or lawful precedent for them to be taxed this half shekel, and so they don't pay. And so they're found on the census, but they've not paid their half shekel. And what is the result? In Exodus 30, we're told that a plague will come on those who are registered but haven't paid, or those who are unregistered and haven't paid. And so this plague comes on the under 20s, on this 200,000 number that we found before. And it says in 2 Samuel that 70,000 people died in Israel and Judah. 70,000. This leaves you with 130,000 people left. Now, why is that significant? Originally, I just read through this and I thought, okay, 130,000, I'm not sure why that matters, why it's important at all. But if you get forward in the passage just a little bit in 2 Samuel, you'll see that David goes and builds an altar. He's commanded to go and build an altar after this plague occurs, after God turns toward Jerusalem and relents. He turns toward Jerusalem and stops the plague. He says to the death angel, that's enough. We've done the work we need to do. Let's see what David's going to do. So he's more merciful than he even should be, according to his own law he set out in Exodus 30. Instead of killing all those who are registered but unpaid, he only kills 70,000. But David, wanting this to stop, makes a plea to the Lord, and he's told, go and build an altar at this specific spot. And he goes, and the man there that owns this threshing floor, this area of land that he's supposed to buy, says to him, I'll just give it to you. And David says, no, I'm not going to just get it for free because I'm the king. I'm going to pay for it. And so he does. And how much does he pay? Well, in 2 Samuel, you're told he pays 50 shekels. But in 1 Chronicles, you're told he pays 600 shekels. How do we justify this? Well, in 2 Samuel, it's talking about the sacrifices itself. And in 1 Chronicles, it's talking about the land itself. So 600 for the land, 50 for the sacrifices. You get a total of 650 shekels that he paid for this land. Why? Is that just the number that they came across? And if so, why does it matter that that's what he paid for it? But the Bible is so intentional. God wrote everything out here through his messengers, through his servants, for a purpose. And so when you look deeper, you realize there is a purpose to this number that David pays of 650 shekels. And what is that purpose? It all goes back to this census that David wrongfully took of those under 20. So 650 shekels, if you take that and divide it by multiply it by 2, because each person is only supposed to have to pay half a shekel, you get 1,300 half shekels. So 650 times 2, 1,300, that's a half shekel for 1,300 people that David could pay for in this census that he wrongfully took. And I know what you're thinking. 1,300, that doesn't pay for 130,000 that are still alive of that original 200,000 under 20s that were alive and counted in Israel and Judah. And you're right, except for there is this really interesting verse in 2 Samuel 24:3 and 1 Chronicles 21:3 that I would just read right over. Let me see if I can find it here. So after David says to Joab to go and count the people, Joab says this, but Joab said to the king, may the Lord your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still see it. But why does my lord delight in this thing? And so Joab is not very happy that he's going to count these under 20s, and he says this thing, may they be multiplied 100 times. What in the world does that mean? It sounds like he's just saying, well, I hope that the number we find is bigger than you'd even think and that it continues to grow after that. Just like a random blessing, right? But there's actually a point to this. What Joab is saying is, may one person age 20 and over equal 100 people under 20. So rather than going and counting each individual person, we're going to take God at his word a little bit. He said he'd multiply us. That word has its roots in the word tens. And so we're going to say that each one person 20 and over is responsible for about 100 people under 20. And this kind of makes sense because each person in Israel, imagine they marry someone and then they have 15 kids. They had a lot of kids back then. And then those kids each have 15 kids. It's very possible that one person could be responsible for 100 people. But this also sits really well with David because not only does it take less time to go and count all those people, if you're just counting those over 20 and then kind of rounding or giving a some estimate of the under 20s, but also it inflates his numbers even more. But by saying this, what this scripture means is that if each person aged 20 and over equals a half shekel per person, then 100 people under 20, or the offspring of Israel, they should equal a half shekel per 100 persons. So 100 people under 20 equals one full person over 20. And this is how the count was taken. And so this 1,300 that David pays, this 1,300 half shekels times 100 actually covers the 130,000 that are still left alive in Israel that are under 20. And to me, this is just incredible because it shows God's intentionality. It shows that there aren't contradictions from 2 Samuel to 1 Chronicles. While most people would look at that and say, clearly two different numbers, the same census, contradiction. No, it just takes a little bit of digging, a little bit of knowledge of the history of Israel, the laws of Israel, what each section is talking about and the differences between each one. And you realize that there is so much something incredible going on here, that God has written the Bible to this level of detail for our benefit. Additionally, at the end of this, you find out that this portion of land that David buys for 650 shekels is not just any portion of land that he builds an altar on. This is the future site of the temple. And this also falls in line with Exodus 30, where it says this money is to be given on behalf of the tabernacle. Well, now this money that David uses to purchase the lives of those 130,000 that are about to die in plague, or that should rightfully die in plague because of his actions of wrongfully counting them in the census, now that money is going towards the future home of the temple. And so that money is still being rightfully used. And you get this beautiful story where originally you're left hanging, you're left kind of empty, you're left kind of wondering, you're left with a blank feeling. Now you reach this beautiful conclusion and this hope for the future, this pointing forward to the time where the temple will be built, to the time when Jesus Christ will come on the scene and forgive all sins and save all those who are destined for death. It's just this beautiful summation of the whole story that ends here, when originally all you had was an empty telling of facts. And I just think that is incredible, and I hope you followed and also found it just as amazing. The Bible is full of things like this.